Hello, I'm Glenn Anderson with the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. This TV series explores a variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolent social change. The U.S. war in Iraq seems to have dropped out of the news, but are those problems really solved, or has a sleight-of-hand maneuver of public relations trickery shifted our attention from the bad war in Iraq to the good war in Afghanistan? And why has the U.S. war in Afghanistan escalated into Pakistan, where the U.S. is attacking people, including many innocent civilians, in a country that is supposed to be our ally? The American people are long overdue in understanding Pakistan and the realities that seem to be baffling the Obama administration and the Pentagon. This month's TV program features two very knowledgeable and articulate guests who have good insights into other parts of the world. Our guests will clearly explain the historical background and context and the current events regarding Pakistan. And so I'm happy to welcome Zahid Shariff and Steve Niva. Zahid Shariff is originally from Pakistan, but he's lived in the United States for 40 years, and he's a U.S. citizen. He teaches post-colonial politics at the Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington. Steve Niva teaches international politics and Middle East studies at the Evergreen State College. He's written extensively about U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, and his writings have appeared in many respected periodicals. So I'm happy to have both of you here. This will be a very fact-filled and insightful program, so thanks for being guests. I want to make sure that viewers know what we're talking about, because Pakistan is a place where people may have heard the name, but they may not have a clear idea about where it is. It's located between Afghanistan and India. And so Afghanistan is to the northwest of Pakistan, and India is to the southeast. At the south edge is the Arabian Sea, and at the northeast corner is the border with China. So you can see it's between Afghanistan, which is to the northwest, and India to the southeast. And we'll be talking about both of those countries. Pakistan has really a very wide variety of geological and geographical features, from high mountains to lush valleys and deserts and waterfront. Some parts of Pakistan are very remote. And the nation has a great variety also of ethnic groups and languages, and some of these ethnic groups and languages are common to the people on other sides of their national border, so that adds some complexity. I wonder, Zahid, if you could provide just a little bit of a historical introduction to help our viewers understand Pakistan's history in the context of what we'll be talking about on this show.
Certainly. Pakistan's border with Afghanistan is a very long and a porous one. And even the British, when they ruled over the subcontinent, they were not able to demark that clearly. So the people go back and forth quite easily. But I want to particularly mention the conflict within Afghanistan, which has been the source of so much trouble. It was in the 1970s, early 70s, that a left-wing government came to power. And they introduced some very good reforms. The land was to be reformed, that is, redistributed. Women were to go to school, educational expenditures increased, a variety of things of that kind. At that time, Zbigniew Brzezinski was the national security advisor to President Carter. And he said he thought that this would be a good time to ensnare Soviet Union into a trap in Afghanistan. Consequently, he began to, through Pakistan, began to send aid to those groups that were resisting this kind of a progressive change. So the religious groups, the big landlords, and the warlords were financed and helped and even armed to fight against these kinds of changes from Kabul.
Through the United States government and with our tax dollars.
Yes.
Yes.
And as the resistance to this those changes grew, exactly what this genius of a man predicted happened, and that is that the Soviet help was sought. The Soviet eventually troops began to move in, and this is what he wanted: make Afghanistan the Soviet Vietnam. And that's when the major conflict started. And after that, as probably most people know, huge amount of, this is the first time, incidentally, that the CIA itself was involved in operating a war indirectly through the Mujahideen. Mujahideen is a word, Arabic word, which is the plural of one who wages jihad. And the CIA worked with them. A huge amount of military equipment and training and funding was poured through Pakistan, working with the millions of refugees that had come into Pakistan from Afghanistan. And they took on a Herculean task of fighting a major superpower at that time, the Soviet Union. And here's what I want to make a very critical point. After 10 years of this war, after this, the Mujahideen had taken heavy casualties, the Soviets were indeed ousted. And at that critical point, that was in 1989, that the American presence from the area abruptly, suddenly disappeared. And that sudden departure led to a feeling of considerable resentment against the United States. Until that time, the Mujahideen were working hand in glove with the United States. We were very happy to work with them because they were liberating their country, they felt. And after they left, after the United States suddenly disappeared, a number of things happened very quickly, and that is they didn't have a common enemy, they felt betrayed, and on the scene was Osama bin Laden, who exploited those feelings. That was one thing. The second thing he did was he represented in his own persona an individual who had represented complete personal sacrifice of a considerable significance. He was a multimillionaire, but he was living with the people. And thirdly, he gave them a narrative. The narrative was that of the West always having done them in, starting with the Crusades. And these three things galvanized at least a small group at that time into what's now called Al-Qaeda. And that was the beginning of the end, I think, essentially, of what we're noticing today.
Yeah, thanks. It's just a fascinating story, and the roots of what we have today go back to that era. Could you say something about the internal dynamics of power within Pakistan? We'll explore that in some more depth later in the program, but I just want the viewers to get a handle on what Pakistan's power structure is briefly.
Before I do that, let me say one thing. That sudden departure of the United States has been something that two secretaries of state, Condoleezza Rice and Hillary Clinton, have said it was a mistake, have now admitted. So indeed has Robert Gates, the defense secretary. But you know, admitting a mistake years afterwards does not undo the consequences that flow from this. I think it's not a mistake, it's a massive blunder that I don't know if we can ever undo the damage it did.
And that's certainly not the first time that Pakistanis have felt betrayed by the United States. I mean, the United States has had a long history of interactions with Pakistan and using Pakistan, in a sense, for its own ends, going back to the 1950s and 60s during the era of the alleged communist threat, when we supported we, in a sense, used Pakistan to serve our foreign policy objectives, and then sort of didn't follow up with real support for the country. You know, I think this is a long trend between the United States and Pakistan that we see again today.
Right, and we'll be covering some of that, I hope, later on in the program.
Yeah.
That's all more raw data that people need to make sense of what's going on these days.
But I think Steve is quite right. He's summed up an overall feeling that Pakistanis have, and that is of being used and discarded.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Every night, and this keeps happening over and over and over again, and they've just kind of fed up.
So tell us something a little bit about the power structure, the power dynamics within Pakistan, and then we'll explore this a bit further later in the program.
Well, the Pakistani power dynamics have been greatly influenced by United States connection. In early years of Pakistan's existence, Pakistan was persuaded to join two military pacts. Excuse me. And this was the height of Cold War. Huge amount of military aid was poured into Pakistan. As a consequence, one institution of the country grew and grew and grew. The natural corollary of that is that military coups began to happen. First one, second, third, and fourth. Pervez Musharraf was the fourth military dictator of Pakistan. And in each case, the United States government was happy to work with them. And the other part that I want to mention is that while the United States government now insists that Pakistan become a democracy and frowns upon any anti-democratic measures or behavior, the United States never supported democratic groups when they were fighting against the military dictators that the United States was conducting its business in a very friendly way.
Right. And also is part of a larger pattern that the United States repeats throughout the world, notably in Latin America, but so many other places too, where the United States government would rather have a military dictatorship that we can sort of dominate rather than a democracy that comes up from below that we can't dominate.
And if I could add something about the internal power structure within Pakistan, I mean, at one level there is a parliamentary system. So you do have governments being elected, you do have parties competing, and we have a current President Zardawi right now, and Zardari, I think. Yeah. And but as Zahid said, the military is really the central institution in society. But there's a further level. There's sort of like a deep state within that, which is the Pakistani intelligence services, the ISI, which is one more layer of control. A lot of former military officers, a lot of former intelligence officers, a whole shadowy network that is part of the basic primary power structure within Pakistan. So there's several layers to the onion within Pakistan. And furthermore, at this time, there are a lot of internal dynamics in terms of separatist politics in Baluchistan, which is one of the provinces in the south on the border with Iran. In other areas, there have been various civil conflicts going on, and you can't ignore those as well.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of complexities. I think it's helpful to understand all that stuff because we tend to see things in this polarized way, whether it's during the Cold War, where it's us versus the communists, or whether now where it's us versus Muslims or terrorists or whatever the demon is.
Yeah, and that's the thing with Pakistan, I think, is people would say, oh, it's just a Muslim country, as if they can generalize from that. No, it's an extremely complex country with various languages, ethnic groups, and political divisions and class divisions.
And its own unique historical trajectory and institutions and things,
And let me add that even within Pakistan, there's been tremendous variation in the popular opinion towards the United States. In the 50s, the pro-American feeling was very strong. It was in the 60s when the American government supported the first military dictator, Ayub Khan, that it began to change, and also Vietnam was happening at the same time. In the 70s, again, the feeling was favorable. The 1980s, when the Afghan war was going on, at that time it was lukewarm. And then when United States, until recently, when the United States government poured in a lot of generous aid for the Kashmiri earthquake victims, Pakistani public opinion immediately changed favorably to the United States. This idea that these Pakistani fanatics, they're always like that, is just ridiculous.
Right. Yeah, the latest public opinion polling I've seen about Pakistan is that it's like 70% think of the United States as the greatest threat to their security, and it's like twice as large a percentage as think of Al-Qaeda or Taliban or whatever. It's like, you know, it's like we've driven them against us.
But that's what they think now. What I'm trying to say is that they did not always think that.
Right.
It's fluctuated over time.
Right. Yeah.
It's fluctuated in response to actions that are taken.
And these latest polls show a serious deterioration of attitude toward the United States because of recent actions that we'll be talking about.
I hope Steve will talk
program.
about that.
I'm going to let Glenn lead.
Well, give us a bit of context for this development of the terrorism that we think of as a relatively new development, September 11, 2001 kind of stuff, where the public heard about Osama bin Laden, whom we've discussed just briefly here, but we actually have background in our government in him, and the movement that he represents and some of the sources of that terrorism, just so people can understand that angle of it.
Yeah. Well, Zahid laid out the backstory, in a sense, was that the largest CIA operation in history, the Afghan War, the supporting of the Mujahideen fighters against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, led to our support, along with Saudi Arabia and the dictator who had come to power in a coup in Pakistan at the time, General Zia-ul-Haq, along with pretty conservative forces in Pakistan and the ISI, to support mobilizing people in the Middle East to fight in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union. And that's really the seed of Al-Qaeda, the notion that Muslims were fighting a jihad against the Soviets, and they fought a very classic guerrilla war campaign, much like the Vietnamese fought against the United States in Vietnam, or the Algerians fought against the French in Algeria. But after the switch, after the U.S. abandoned the Afghanis and abandoned Pakistan after this massive operation, and after the United States fought the war with Iraq, which really was a big turning point for Osama bin Laden, this network, which had been mobilized, began to turn on the United States. And it began to see the United States as its primary ally, particularly the notion that American forces were in Saudi Arabia, in the Gulf.
Right. Yeah, you don't mean ally, you mean enemy.
Excuse me, the United States is a major enemy, particularly because American troops were now in Saudi Arabia for the first time in the land of Mecca and Medina.
It's the Holy Land.
Yeah. And that was really the turning point for bin Laden when he launches Al-Qaeda. And that's what's led to, eventually, the adoption of the tactics that we see today. It's no longer classic guerrilla war because they're not wars being waged on the turf with anybody. until the United States invaded Iraq and Afghanistan. But these groups began to look for alternative tactics, what we think of as asymmetric tactics.
Right.
When you're confronted with a superior enemy, you find ways to attack them outside of their strong suit. And, and if their strong suit is conventional military force, then people turn to alternatives, like suicide bombing, like the terror attacks of 9/11, for example.
Yeah. So the word symmetry has to do with like real balance. And so something that's not balanced is asymmetrical. And
That's right.
You and others have referred to this as asymmetrical warfare, where
That's right.
Instead of like you line up with tanks, opposing tanks on a battlefield, if one place has all the heavy military equipment, the other has to figure out some other way.
And this is the kind of war we're seeing now all over the world. We're seeing this in Iraq, we're seeing this in Afghanistan, where the enemies of the U.S. will not fight it on the open field. They will fight it through various other ways.
Well, and we did that with Britain when the colonists
That's true.
in the 1700s wanted to be free from British colonialism. The British would wear bright red coats that were very visible and march in a straight line on down out the field.
Absolutely.
And the Americans were hiding behind trees, not playing fair.
That's right.
But so it was like our own American historical example of asymmetrical.
Absolutely. And that's, you think of the tactics being used today in Iraq and Afghanistan, and it's primarily IEDs. It's primarily IEDs and suicide bombers. Why? Well, because these are the only unconventional ways of striking at weak spots in what the American occupations in both countries can control for. So this is the new kind of battlefield that we have, that we're being confronted with at this time.
So after September 11, the United States connected with a bunch of elements that they called the Northern Alliance. I think people might remember that term, but might not know who that was. And we overthrew the government of Afghanistan, capital city Kabul. And tell us about that process. Who is the Northern Alliance? What were the dynamics of that overthrow and the replacement government that the U.S. set up?
Northern Alliance was a group of ethnic groups that were pushed into one corner by the Taliban government because they would...
Afghanistan's Taliban government.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And they held only 10% of the territory, and their popular support in Afghanistan was approximately the same percent, about 10%. When the United States wanted to come and invade Afghanistan, they sought the help of Northern Alliance. In fact, they worked with them to invade the Taliban governed Afghanistan. Well, there wasn't much of a fight because Taliban essentially abandoned. And many of the warlords, their account in the New York Times magazine was just amazing on this issue. They would send a messenger ahead of time to the provincial governor, who was quite often a drug lord also, and say, "How much do you want?" To switch sides. And they would say so-and-so. And the army was going with truckloads of American currency. And they'd hand in the currency and the person would join their hands. This is a major part of the way that Afghanistan fell into United States hands, because the casualties on both sides were minimal. So Northern Alliance then, the Taliban left and the others were bought over, and the Northern Alliance formed government. Mm-hmm. But Northern Alliance is a minority ethnic government. Mm-hmm. Since then, efforts have been made. Since then, I think the resentment against that government, and because of them, because the United States supports them against the United States, has to do not only for ideological reasons. I think that's less the case. It has to do with the fact that they're a minority government. Not all the Pashtuns, which is the largest ethnic group, are Talibans, mm-hmm. but they want part of the governmental, positions and involvement and participation. For a long time, Hamid Karzai, who was a handpicked ruler of Afghanistan, did not want that.
Right, handpicked by the United States.
Right.
Yeah.
And eventually, now that he's willing, he says he's willing, under the United States pressure, to bring in other ethnic groups. But many people doubt whether how sincere that those statements are. So now the United States and Afghanistan Afghanistan government are on board saying they would like wider participation in government. But the fact, I think, is that the clique, the Northern Alliance clique that runs the country are so corrupt, and their hold on government is so strong now that they don't want to share it with anyone.
Right. We've pumped all kinds of money and military power and everything else in there, and we've cast the United States status with those corrupt people, and there's not that much support for them, as I understand, throughout the country. People have referred to Karzai as the mayor of Kabul rather than the leader of the whole country, because they don't have that much clout outside of city limits.
That's right.
And so, but the war has been going, and I want to kind of jump ahead into the war that the United States has been pushing in Afghanistan is not going well there. Everybody knows it's going badly. We don't have the public support. It's terribly corrupt in way more ways than we have time to document during this program, and it's been escalated, especially by Obama, into Pakistan. And I want to talk about that in just a bit, or get into that. There's another element of this that we haven't said much of, and that's India, which is the neighbor of Pakistan. And in fact, when Britain ruled India, they were all one country, and with partition, with India's independence in 1947, Pakistan also became independent as a Muslim country. And then there was this massive flow of people from one to the other, but still a substantial minority of Hindus in Pakistan and Muslims in India still. And then they've had the conflict over Kashmir. And so there's been actually a tension and conflict and some wars since 1947 between India and Pakistan. And that plays in. Can you say something about how that's a factor in what we've been talking about, the role of India?
You want to talk about Kashmir?
Well, I don't. That's just a little part up in the far northeast.
Yeah.
I think it's just enough just to
Well,
say it's
there's a bigger point here. There's a bigger point that's in Glenn's question, which is for Pakistan, their primary concern is not Al-Qaeda, the threat of Al-Qaeda. Their primary concern is not the Taliban or the threat of Taliban. For Pakistan, their primary concern is with India.
Yeah,
this is their primary strategic concern because of, as you pointed out, and maybe Zahid could talk more about this, because the birth of Pakistan happened through the splitting up of India or the splitting up of the former colony, of the British colony, and both countries were born in the blood of the other.
Right.
Horrible violence, and hundreds of thousands of people, if not more, were killed in that process. And ever since then, the two countries have had a very tumultuous relationship. Right. Several wars have been fought, and both countries are now nuclear armed and have been on alert for attacks from one another. So the point is that for Pakistan, for the United States to come in and say, reorient yourself entirely, forget about your primary strategic concerns, join our war against these terrorists who we think are the most dangerous enemies in the world, it's ridiculous. Right. For most of Pakistan, it'd be like, what do you mean? What are you talking about? We're not.
And so the United States has sent all this military equipment, weapons, and whatever to Pakistan with the intent that they would be up in the northwest to fight the people there. Instead, they went down to the southeast and lined up along the Indian border.
And they're very concerned about who's going to come to power in Afghanistan after the United States leaves. If, according to Obama's plan, we start drawing down in another year. They're very concerned about that, and they would rather have folks who would serve their strategic interests than not, just as any country would. And they're very concerned that India is making inroads into Afghanistan.
When Zahid, when we talked on the phone to prepare for the program, you mentioned some of this, and I found it fascinating. And I wonder if you could highlight a couple of those points.
That thing that Steve just mentioned at the end is critical for Pakistan, and Pakistan seems to be raising their concerns at all kinds of forums, but they don't get much attention. Pakistan's traditional rival is India. Steve is exactly right. That notwithstanding, India has no borders with Afghanistan. India has no security issues in Afghanistan. And yet, Pakistan is extremely worried that it not only has a very large embassy there, India, which has in its own border, within its own borders, has a very large poor population. But it's pouring in $1.5 billion in aid
to
Afghanistan. And particularly worrying for Pakistan is the fact that on the Afghanistan border with Pakistan, India has installed 14 consular offices. Now, Pakistan is completely convinced that those are not showing Indian films to Afghanis. They are sending weapons and spies into Pakistan. And much of the trouble in Balochistan is attributed to India's actions. And this issue, Pakistan keeps raising in all kinds of forums, but the United States is just paying no attention to that.
Right. And so Pakistan is feeling squeezed by India on actually both sides, the direct Indian border and also where India has possibly militarized the Afghan border. We don't know, but it's pressure.
I want to re-emphasize what Steve just said, and that is the deadline for the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan has been announced by President Obama already. And it's, I think, clear to almost everyone that in some shape or form, the Taliban or Pashtuns, or however you want to describe them, are going to be part of the future government of Afghanistan. And why should Pakistan do America's bidding to the point that they are totally antagonized, and when they form their government, they will not only turn against Pakistan, but might even form alliances with India.
Yeah. So the U.S., the explicit U.S. policy is very simplistic and doesn't reflect the realities that Pakistanis understand.
Back to the old story here that we've been developing, which is, once again, the U.S. is only interested in Pakistan to the extent it serves its interests, and will pressure it to do so, even if it's against its own national interest, which clearly are under challenge right now.
Yeah, and we mentioned the long affinity that the U.S. government has had for the military dictators like Zia al-Haq some years ago, and then more recently Pervez Musharraf, who was also very corrupt and grabbed a lot of power in various ways, and fired the Supreme Court justice when the Supreme Court justice was ruling against him. And what was interesting with that was that the judges went out basically on strike and put a lot of pressure on, and the Supreme Court Chief Justice got reinstated. That was after Musharraf's successor came in?
What happened is that there were two cases coming up to the Supreme Court, which were, it was believed, would go against President Musharraf. So President Musharraf invited the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Arif Chaudhry is his name, and the story is told that there were 5 4-star generals in President Musharraf's office, and in that office the Chief Justice was called in and pressured to resign. And this amazingly courageous man said, "You can do what you want with me, I'm not resigning." And so he was fired against all constitutional rules, even the ones that President Musharraf had installed, put into place himself. Well, he was removed from office anyway, and a new Chief Justice appointed, which did exactly what President Musharraf wanted. After that happened, agitation started in the country. A year later, President Musharraf was out of office. And then even President Zardari, who took office, he too had promised that he would restore the Chief Justice to his office from which he was unfairly removed. Even he did not want to implement it. That is when they call the Black Coats March.
Yeah, the judges wore black coats.
These are the lawyers.
Yeah. Oh, the lawyers.
Lawyers.
Yes.
Yeah. And they were so, I think this is the only time in human history that the lawyer-led revolution succeeded.
Yes.
And it was a long march that they started, but when they went from Lahore, the city I come from, to Gujranwala, which is about 35 miles, the story is told, whether it's true or not, I don't know, that the military chief went to see the president, Zardari, and said, "The country is unstable. You have to yield." Then President Zardari was willing to say, "I'll reinstate the Chief Justice."
Yeah.
And he was reinstated.
So let's bring this up to what's been happening at the end of Bush's term and the first year plus of Obama's term, which is these attacks by unmanned airplanes, drones, United States planes that go into Pakistan and target supposedly specific targets, but it looks as though as of like mid-May when we're taping this program, the targeting rules have been loosened up a lot, and they're going after, as I understand it from the sources I've read, lots of targets. In many cases, they don't even know the names of who they're targeting, but they're using various kinds of high-tech ways to track people, and if somebody has movements going here or there that make it look suspicious, they target that person for killing from an airplane.
Yeah. So what we need to understand here is that we now have a war in Afghanistan that has crossed into Pakistan, that has crossed across this borderland that Zahid said really doesn't have a very clearly defined border to begin with, but is clearly crossed into Pakistan now. And the reason why it has is because, maybe ironically, President Obama decided to escalate the war at the end of 2009, to raise the number of troops, to try a new strategy, to use more counterinsurgency theory and doctrine, to win hearts and minds.
This sounds more and more like Vietnam.
It sounds a lot because as I'll explain, and because the situation is that, of course, like any guerrilla movement, the Taliban and the various groups that we call the Taliban that are resisting the American occupation.
And that's another loose thing. It's like anybody that disagrees with us, we say, oh, they're Taliban. Just like anybody that disagreed with us, we'd say, oh, they're communist.
Yeah. They have all the time in the world, and because they're from there,
they live there.
They see the timeline, so they will move across the border. They also have networks of resupply across the border in the tribal areas, as they're called, of Pakistan, North Waziristan, South Waziristan, these former federal tribal areas in particular, but also other areas in Baluchistan, where, for example, the former Taliban government has its sort of bases and so what the Obama administration has decided is that they feel like they cannot successfully prosecute their escalation in order to sort of pressure the Taliban into accepting their terms because they know they can never truly defeat it. Yet they have to do something about the ability of these folks to cross the borderlands, to cross into Pakistan. And you have two options. Either you do it yourself, or you get the Pakistani military to do it for you. And as we've just talked about, the Pakistani military it would be a massive effort to begin with because they've never controlled these particular areas.
Yeah.
It would be great cost of lives and bloodshed for the Pakistani military to begin with. And moreover, as we've talked about, they have an interest in alliances with some of these groups because they're worried about what comes next in Afghanistan afterwards.
It's a politically impossible thing for them to do.
So what we've done is tried to pressure them to take action. And they've taken action in some areas, but not in the primary areas that are the main sanctuaries. And here we're getting into the Vietnam analogy, much like the Viet Minh had the Ho Chi Minh Trail, went through Laos, and went through Cambodia. We have this area, particularly North Waziristan it's called, where some of these networks are located. And so what we've done is we've turned to robotics. We've turned to unmanned aerial systems and special forces. It's not just drone strikes. It's also special forces that we now know are operating. And we also have private military contractors, former Blackwater XE people and others who have appeared in Pakistan. And Pakistan's made it very clear to us they don't want our forces in their territory, yet this is what's happening. So the strikes have increased dramatically. There's been probably from, at this time we're discussing this, over 130 in the past year and a half maybe. Probably 1,000 people have been killed in the context of these strikes. We're using Reapers now, not just the Predator
was the
Predator drone, the smaller
one.
Reapers
these are huge.
They had the wingspan of a Boeing. Yeah, exactly. And civilian casualties are growing. So this is what's happening. The war is spreading into Pakistan.
Well, and we're getting more loose, like I say, about who we target. Many of these are people we don't even know their names.
Exactly.
But they're moving from here to there, so we assume they must be guilty. And this is with no due process. This is what amazes me, is like if the government thought somebody in your neighborhood was a bad guy who might do something to us in the future, the government wouldn't go in and just like shoot up your neighborhood or bomb your neighborhood. You know, if somebody is a criminal, if they've done something, you arrest them, you put them in trial, they have due process. This has none of that, and it's in a different country. I mean, what would we do? What would the United States do if, say, Portugal said, well, somebody in your neighborhood might do something bad to Portugal in the future, and so Portugal comes over and bombs your neighborhood? Would the United States allow that? Heck no. No, but we do that, and it's like the American people are taught not to question that, because after all, we're Americans and we can do anything we want.
Yeah, there's
and other countries are more sensitive.
Yeah, there's a couple issues there. One is just a question of international law and legality, and these strikes are clearly illegal.
Yeah.
There's no question about it. But I think more to the point of our discussion is that they're perhaps, at best you could argue, and we've seen this from the Israeli case and from other cases, at best you can argue about sort of assassination and hit squad campaigns is that they have short-term effects. At best you can say short-term disruption effects in the enemy you're trying to fight. In the long run, however, these groups are networks, really. They don't really have formal hierarchies. One leader can be replaced by another. And moreover, the impact on the civilian population, especially in Pakistan, where, like we've been talking about, there's no necessary reason for folks in Pakistan to be anti-American, to be opposed to the United States. But what we've just done is we've handed on a silver platter a reason for people to be angry with us. It confirms the narrative of those who actually do want to align with the Taliban in Afghanistan, for example, or who do want to wage a wider war against the United States. It has actually empowered those people. Right. And I think that's the gravest mistake that we've made.
Right. And so what it does then is it provokes people to want to retaliate and continue the cycle of violence. And the term blowback is a couple decades old, actually, but it's the sense that we do these things and then consequences come home to roost, whether on September 11 or the guy who had built that ineffective car bomb at Times Square, who was a U.S. citizen, by the way, although he had Pakistani roots, but he reportedly he had been so outraged by U.S. drone activity in Pakistan that he felt the need to do something, and so he sort of learn how to make a car bomb, but he didn't learn very well. But that's the kind of thing that happens because a direct result of our U.S. policies there.
Yeah, quite often this point is lost. Quite often when we talk about somebody doing something like this or a grouping responsible, in the United States popular media and even scholarly literature, it is almost invariably related to culture and religion. Never to United States actions or a response to something that's been done to them.
Right.
Never.
Yeah, yeah. And this guy had seemed to be a normal reaction of revulsion that the United States was doing these drone attacks against civilians in his country, and no wonder he was angry as a result.
No one should be surprised. I mean, this has been the theme since September 11th, since the United States decided that the response to September 11th would be military strikes in other parts of the world. The so-called notion that if we fight them over there, they won't fight us over here. In fact, it's been exactly the opposite.
Yeah.
We fight them over there, them being not only people who we really are concerned with, but also so many others, and we create what many people call sort of accidental guerrillas or others who then become our enemies.
Right.
And for example, the 7/7 bombers in London, they were homegrown British Muslims who had been radicalized by seeing Britain align with the U.S., killing Muslims in other countries. I mean, this is nothing new or different. But what is different in this case, however, is that groups in Pakistan who are not Al-Qaeda are now being perhaps radicalized against the United States through our extension of the war in Afghanistan into Pakistan.
You, when we were preparing for the program and you and I were talking on the phone, you talked about the cost that Pakistani people have paid for the U.S. government's relationships with the Pakistani government over the years. Can you tell us something of that? We're running tight on time, but it's an important point.
Yeah, I think first of all I mentioned already the military aid that the United States gave to Pakistan bloated one institution, and that was the military. And the price that Pakistan has paid for that is the lack of development of democratic institutions. Right. The second price that Pakistan has paid is that the United States not only poured in military aid, this is a point that's not well known. United States also began to provide financial support to Islamic groups. At that time, it was thought that in a Cold War atmosphere, religion was a good way to combat what was called then godless communism. And so over the years, these groups that have gone so dangerous now grew on American money. There's a marvelous book that I do want to mention. It's called Devil's War. And it is a documentation of United States funding of religious groups, not just in Pakistan, but in the Middle East, right after Second World War. It continued and produced results which were just disastrous for the United States. That's one. Second. The third one is, I will say quickly, Pakistan, soon after the Soviets were expelled, put in an order for F-16s. But after the money had been paid, the Pressler Amendment was passed by Congress. And so the Pressler Amendment said that any country that's suspected of developing nuclear capability will not receive any military equipment. So Pakistan said, if we can't get the planes, could we have our money back? We were told, no, you cannot. Not only that, Pakistan began to be charged parking fees on top of that. The money, this was held up for almost 10 years. And this kind of a thing doesn't make the news here, or people don't remember this very much. But in Pakistan, small country, that was a lot of money for Pakistan. People remember those things.
Yeah.
Again, see, this was soon after the Soviet war. This, again, the feeling that Steve has mentioned, summarized so well. We were used then, now we've been used, now our money is being confiscated, no planes, you can be discarded.
Right.
Eventually, Clinton, in his second term, I think, he had it, he has sold those planes to Indonesia and recovered some money and gave some money back.
And Indonesia is another brutal government that deserves to be talked about, but that's another matter and another program. But that's a very, very brutal government, and the United States has a bad relationship. In the things that we're talking about, there's really a continuity over time, and in preparing for the program, you folks are mentioning things like from the Eisenhower administration in the 1950s and on and on and on, and certainly there's a great deal of continuity from the George W. Bush policies regarding foreign affairs and taking away our constitutional rights and all that stuff. And although Obama had run on a platform of change, he's really doing a remarkable amount of continuity and even escalation of some of the worst parts.
Yeah, it's. Go ahead, Glenn.
Well, so I just want to do that and see if we can. We got a few more things I want to cover before we wrap up. One of the things that doesn't get serious enough consideration is, are these anti-terrorism policies working? And it seems like no, they're not. We're making things worse. And it's just you know, the news reports say, oh, we got the number 2 guy, or we got the number 3 guy or something. And like you said, it's not a hierarchy. It's but even if it were even if it were like we wanted to destroy the General Electric Corporation, so we'll get rid of their vice presidents, they would just find somebody else to hire or promote.
Yeah.
And these aren't even hierarchies, these are movements. So it's like if you want to kill the environmental movement in this country, if you kill a couple of the top environmentalists, that's not going to kill the environmental movement. There are millions of people who care about the environment, and the environmental movement would continue anyway.
Yeah.
And so the whole model that they're going from, pretending that this is a hierarchy where you get rid of the top people and that'll eliminate the movement, is absolutely bogus, and they should know that.
I mean,
they should know that.
I would say that that there are some differences between the Obama policies and the Bush policies. There are some, I think, and some substantive differences. But on the other hand, however, it's still within the same paradigm. And I think that's the problem. He's changed the name. We don't call it the war on terror anymore. We call it, I don't know what we call it now.
It's the same model.
But it's the same model, which is that an American military presence can somehow shift a balance of power in our favor against Islamic radicalism, however defined,
which is
Al-Qaeda,
grassroots,
right? And and we were talking earlier about the notions of asymmetric war and insurgencies and so on. And the lesson of history there is you can't defeat ideas with weapons. Yeah. The only way you can defeat ideas is with demonstrable alternatives.
Yeah,
in other words, a better society, more support for democratic institutions, bringing the desperately poor in Pakistan, for example, or in Afghanistan out of poverty. Yeah. I mean, you take away the conditions that enable extremists to mobilize others rather than handing them their story on a silver platter by showing up in full force, looking like you just came from outer space, and knowing nothing about their culture or context. I mean, poor American military soldiers, you know, who I have great sympathy for, who are put in the worst situations in Afghanistan, of all places, to be put in Afghanistan where you're completely ignorant. You've been fed a whole shipload of lies about Islam and all these sort of paranoid notions about them. Anyway. You know, to be in a place where you're really not doing any good, and you're dying while you're not doing any good, it's a great tragedy. So what we need are policies that address the political roots of these conflicts and the social roots.
Could we take like about 1 or 2 minutes to lay out what other recommendations you may have for what U.S. policy should be for Pakistan or that region? Just like
What for Pakistan,
relatively
Zahid?
briefly.
What do you think?
For Pakistan, I think that what needs to happen is to strengthen the democratic process. When the United States decided to do that, it was in such a haphazard manner. Instead of saying we'll support the democratic forces and let anyone who is popular through the democratic vote to emerge, the United States picked a person ahead of time. And that was Benazir Bhutto.
Oh, yes. Who was very corrupt also.
And then her husband became just because the United States picked them up, they were already had become a liability for them for the future. But doing that ahead of time, what kind of a democratic commitment is that?
Right.
Anyways, that's one thing I wish the United States government would
Support the democratic process, whatever that comes out.
Exactly.
It's true. In the long run, that actually is your best policy.
Yeah.
That's one thing. The second thing is that to understand Pakistan's concerns too. Enforcing only your own interests and insist that they do what you're bidding, and then threatening them like Hillary Clinton did the other day concerning Shahzad. She said, we made it very clear that if, heaven forbid, an attack like this that we can trace back to Pakistan were to have been successful, there would have been severe consequences. These kinds of threats, I don't know what they mean, because Pakistan government cannot control all the people who come and go in that country.
He's not a Pakistani citizen, he's a United States citizen. And that's the kind of U.S. heavy-handedness that just fosters resentment from other people.
So the United States government has been very generous to Pakistan. There's a very good aid package there. But with
8.5 million over 5 years, I think. Yeah, it's big. Billion.
Yeah.
But this kind of statement trumps that.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I know that when we talked on the phone, both of you had said that we have to recognize the needs of all the parties involved, the neighbors, the region, and the complexity, and not this single-minded thing.
I want to say one quick thing, and that is that I'm very sorry to see that 1,000 American soldiers have now died in Afghanistan.
That's what
We've done that as of we're taping this program in May of 2010, and we've just hit the 1,000, and it's for bad policy, for brainless policy.
So Glenn, I would add that the root reason, as we talked about, of why the U.S. has now extended the war into Pakistan is because Obama decided to escalate on the way to withdraw, which is where I think there is a difference. With Bush, there was an endless, war in Afghanistan. Yeah. With Obama, it's escalation to a point of beginning withdrawal. We'll see if that really happens. But we need to solve the issue in Afghanistan now. We need to move towards negotiations in Afghanistan now. And that has to be with all members of Afghani society. Secondly, then, we need a regional negotiation. And this can address Pakistan's fears about India, for example, the issue of the Chinese involvement, Russia. We need a regional negotiation about stability in Afghanistan that follows our timeline for withdrawal.
Right. Good. Well, thanks to both of you. When somebody feels angry and lashes out in violence against somebody, then that person feels like they need to retaliate and lash out in violence, and you get the cycle. And that's what we've been seeing in a number of countries around there, including across borders. And violence kills and disables people. It bankrupts the countries that practice it, and we need to stop the violence. The military solutions are really the problem. We need to get that. So I want to thank both of you folks. I want to thank the viewers who've been watching. We're all one human family. We all share one planet. We can create a better world, but we all have to work at it, and the world needs exactly what you have to offer. Thanks. Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. This TV series explores a variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolent social change. The U.S. war in Iraq seems to have dropped out of the news, but are those problems really solved, or has a sleight-of-hand maneuver of public relations trickery shifted our attention from the bad war in Iraq to the good war in Afghanistan? And why has the U.S. war in Afghanistan escalated into Pakistan, where the U.S. is attacking people, including many innocent civilians, in a country that is supposed to be our ally? The American people are long overdue in understanding Pakistan and the realities that seem to be baffling the Obama administration and the Pentagon. This month's TV program features two very knowledgeable and articulate guests who have good insights into other parts of the world. Our guests will clearly explain the historical background and context and the current event. Some parts of Pakistan are very remote, and the nation has a great variety also of ethnic groups and languages, and some of these ethnic groups and languages are common to the people on other sides of their national border, so that adds some complexity. I wonder, Zahid, if you could provide just a little bit of a historical introduction to help our viewers understand Pakistan's history in the context of what we'll be talking about on this show.
Certainly. Pakistan's border with Afghanistan is a very long and a porous one. And even the British, when they ruled over the subcontinent, they were not able to demark that clearly. So the people go back and forth quite easily. But I want to particularly mention the conflict within Afghanistan, which has been the source of so much trouble. It was in the 1970s, early 70s, that a left-wing government came to power. And they introduced some very good reforms. The land was to be reformed, that is, redistributed. Women were to go to school, educational expenditures increased, a variety of things of that kind. At that time, Zbigniew Brzezinski was the national security advisor to President Carter. And he said he thought that this would be a good time to ensnare Soviet Union into a trap in Afghanistan. Consequently, he began to, through Pakistan, began to send aid to those groups that were resisting this kind of a progressive change. So the religious groups, the big landlords, and the warlords were financed and helped and even armed to fight against these kinds of changes from Kabul.
Through the United States government and with our tax dollars.
Yes.
Yes.
And as the resistance to this those changes grew, exactly what this genius of a man predicted happened. And that is that the Soviet help was sought. The Soviet eventually troops began to move in, and this is what he wanted: make Afghanistan the Soviet Vietnam. And that's when the major conflict started. And after that, as probably most people know, huge amount of, this is the first time, incidentally, that the CIA itself was involved in operating a war indirectly through the Mujahideen. Mujahideen is a word, Arabic word, which is the plural.
Regarding Pakistan. And so I'm happy to welcome Zahid Shariff and Steve Niva. Zahid Shariff is originally from Pakistan, but he's lived in the United States for 40 years, and he's a U.S. citizen. He teaches post-colonial politics at the Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington. Steve Niva teaches international politics and Middle East studies at the Evergreen State College. He's written extensively about U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, and his writings have appeared in many respected periodicals. So I'm happy to have both of you here. This will be a very fact-filled and insightful program, so thanks for being guests. I want to make sure that viewers know what we're talking about, because Pakistan is a place where people may have heard the name, but they may not have a clear idea about where it is. It's located between Afghanistan and India. And so Afghanistan is to the northwest of Pakistan, and India is to the southeast. At the south edge is the Arabian Sea, and at the northeast corner is the border with China. So you can see it's between Afghanistan, which is to the northwest, and India to the southeast. And we'll be talking about both of those countries. Pakistan has really a very wide variety of geological and geographical features, from high mountains to lush valleys and deserts and waterfalls.